again, welcome to the Museum of Tolerance, and on behalf of everyone, congratulations and thank you on a very insightful, informative, and provocative documentary short.
Well, can I just say thanks as well to you, Liebe, and to everybody at the Museum of Tolerance for hosting this screening. And thanks to all of you for coming as well on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I mean, it's very emotional for me to screen the film here on this day, and to have survivors and those who've served come as well. So I'm very grateful for your time. I'm always grateful for an audience's time, but to come today, you know, I'm very grateful. So thank you.
We're honored to do it, especially on today. Adam, I must ask you, when did your fascination with Claude Lanzmann begin? And why and how did you get exclusive access to the man, and no one has done this before?
So it took a while to get access to him. My background is as a journalist. I'd written a lot about cinema and about documentary film, and I'd interviewed a lot of documentary makers. And I learned about Shoah, and I watched Shoah, and I began reading about the man who made it, and I just couldn't believe what I was reading. I think in North America he's a bit of an enigmatic figure. He's not that well known. His masterpiece film is known, but he himself, you know, there haven't been any films about him. And I was just stunned by what I was reading. Here's a man who fought in the resistance, who killed Nazis as a teenager, who was a lover of Simone de Beauvoir, the great French existentialist philosopher for many years, was friends with Jean-Paul Sartre. And at the center of his life, he'd spent 12 years making this incredible film that had taken him all over the world, that he'd tracked down survivors, Sonderkommandos, SS officers, witnesses, and really put everything into it. So I think even though people knew somewhat about his film, the story behind what went into the making of it and his story hadn't really been told. The next part of the question, how did I get to him? That took some time. When I initially reached out to him, he was very busy. He didn't know who I was, fair enough. And the breakthrough came. I have a friend who works at the BBC, and I said to him, 2015 will mark the 30th anniversary of Shoah's release, so you should play it on British television because it hasn't been on British television since 1987. So you can play the film for the first time in more than a quarter of a century, and I'll make a documentary about the man who made it to go with it as a kind of accompanying thing. And he liked this idea, and he said what I knew he would, which is, well, I can't give you any money. And I said, of course you can't, you know, public broadcasting. But he said, how can I help? And I said, I think that a letter to Claude on BBC-headed paper, just saying that, you know, that this guy's legit and, you know, he really does want to make this film and that we are interested in licensing Shoah and broadcasting it in the UK, I think that would go a long way. And it did. I mean, overnight, Claude said, yes, I agree to meet with the BBC. I agree to have you come to Paris and film with me for a week. I think it was afterwards that I really realized how extraordinary that is and how he doesn't do that. And the BBC did buy Shoah and did broadcast Shoah, and separately I feel kind of pleased about that as well.
So you sat with him for a full week. What was that like?
Yes. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people, and it was probably the greatest interview I've ever done, and maybe the greatest interview I'll ever do. Claude is one of the great French existentialist intellectuals. You know, I mean, I feel like he opened up. I mean, I suppose that's for others to say, but the interview was everything I hoped it would be and more. It was quite physically challenging. He was 87 in 2013 when we did the interview, and he found it just quite physically tiring. And as you see some parts in the film, he didn't particularly enjoy having to revisit those events of making the film. You know, I mean, he's very proud of the film that he made, but it wasn't a pleasant journey for him. You know, it was a constant uphill struggle, and it took its toll on him in almost every way imaginable: mentally, physically, emotionally, financially. You know, he describes at the end of the process, it was like a bereavement.
He says he made the film, but the film made him.
Yes, that it didn't relieve him from anguish. It was the other way around. It filled him with anguish. You know.
Interestingly, you press him at certain times, much the same way that he had to press and goad those he was interviewing to get the real story and go behind the truth. What was that like, and were there other instances that it was just difficult for him to give you what you needed?
Yeah, although, I mean, I do see the parallels, but I think it was a little bit different in that Lanzmann mostly found the interview very physically challenging at 87 and quite tiring, and also, you know, he can be a bit short-tempered and, you know, why are you asking me all these questions? I've already written about this in my book, and everybody's read my book, so why do I need to go over this again? And I think that, especially with the Schubert incident, he thinks that that doesn't reflect very well on him because he lost the camera, he got beaten up, and, you know, he doesn't see it with the perspective that, you know, the admiration that you have for him with everything that he went through to make the film. With Philip Müller and Abraham Bomber and all of the survivors, I think it was different. I think that, you know, Abraham Bomber in the barbershop very much wanted to talk about what he'd been through. He just couldn't. He just physically couldn't. You know, it was overwhelming for him. So I think it was a little bit different, and I did have to kind of pick and choose my battles with Mr. Lanzmann. There are some things he didn't want to talk about. Shoah had a very negative reception in Poland when it came out in 1985. It was banned in the country for a long time. They felt it was an anti-Polish film, and I asked him about that, and he didn't want to talk about that at all. So, and I got the sense that that was a hard no. Whereas when I talked about the incident where he was attacked, I kind of felt out that that was more of a soft no, and that, you know, and I felt we kind of built a rapport, and so as you see, I said, look, it is really important to talk about that.
You'd obviously done a great deal of research and read extensively about the man. Did you learn anything surprising and new during that week that you sat with him?
Well, I wasn't sure what he would talk about or wouldn't talk about. It's a little bit of a sense of knowing which Claude Lanzmann you're going to get on any given day. I mean, there are times he just did a Q&A recently at the Haifa Film Festival in Israel, and somebody asked him about Simone de Beauvoir, and he refused to talk about it. And sometimes he just doesn't want to talk about his childhood in the resistance. So the fact that he opened up about those things was, you know, I was very pleased that he did. And I was surprised that he talked about his near death, you know. I mean, I was aware of it, but, and in the way that he describes it, you know, he has a, well, the French are very poetic, you know. So his tragedy struck in the beautiful daylight, he says. You know, I mean, I give him the credit for the film because he's a natural storyteller, you know, clearly. And that was, I mean, that was the thing I was happiest about, is that in spite of his age, he has perfect total recall for that period of his life. I mean, the events of 1973 to 1985, when he was doing this work, are indelibly burned into his mind. You know, you see when he's talking about the scene with Abraham Bomber in the barbershop, you know, he remembers, there were no prompts there, he remembers the exact conversation as it went down, he remembers the details, you know, that was a very, you know, those were the years of his life, you know, that came to define him.
One thing I learned, I had no idea that it was Aluf Har-Evin's suggestion that he made this film.
Yes.
I know Aluf, he's an extraordinary man with a remarkable history in Israel.
And his daughter Gail provided us the photo of him.
Lovely.
And we've sent him a copy of the film. I gather he's very pleased.
Excellent.
That,
you mentioned to me that Mr. Lanzmann is going to come to the Academy Awards.
Yes, he's coming to the Academy Awards. I'm very pleased about that too. His film wasn't nominated in 1985, so I think it's nice for him to have that moment, to walk the red carpet, to be sat next to me, and to, you know, just to be on the red carpet alongside Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg, and You know, I think he's really looking forward to it, you know. So I do feel very pleased about that. And I also feel pleased that this film is helping his film get seen again by a wider audience, you know. I don't want his film to be thought of as just something for cinephiles, you know, that it's this kind of obscure film that, you know, I mean, it should be a mainstream accessible work. It should be on curriculums, it should be in schools. So if this little documentary can go any way to helping that, then I'll be very pleased. And I'm really pleased that HBO bought it as well. I'm very pleased, you can probably tell I'm very pleased.
And so you should.
But when you set out to make a film, you don't know what it's going to be, and you know, you kind of hope that it will have this reception. And so I'm just very struck by how people are relating to his story.
And everyone here, of course, does just that. And I'd like to offer you the opportunity to ask questions of Adam Benzine. If you raise your hands, as I see many of you are doing, we will bring you a microphone, and then we can hear the question as well as the answer. You have the mic, please.
I'm very grateful that the film was shown today, on the 27th of January, because I was liberated in Auschwitz 71 years ago. So it's very special for me that it was shown today. I have a question for you. I saw the film when it came out. The whole 9.5 hours was divided in 2 parts. And I remember that just the second part when we went home was in the middle of the night already. There is so much more in that film. You partly answered my question when you spoke about Poland in 1985. Do you have any thoughts of exploring the rest of the film? Because we saw only parts, and it's most interesting. It's a great movie. And I don't think you need to worry that it'll be obscure, just hidden away somewhere. It's not just for an audience like here, but you'll be able to show it everywhere. So do you have any plans, I know not for the very now, for the near future, to explore the rest of the movie, just to show his encounters with people in Poland and everywhere else?
Well, we are thinking about making a slightly longer cut, but we're somewhat limited in the amount of material that we managed to get with Claude. So I don't think it would go much beyond 60 minutes. This version is 40 minutes. But really, what I wanted to do was tell the emotional story of how he made this film, more than the technical story, in the hope that it would then bring people to his film. You know, I thought that it would be more accessible to, you know, the kind of questions that I asked him when I was interviewing him. They were technical in nature, about how he had to change magazines every 11 minutes when he was filming, and you know, cameras and that kind of stuff. But I was often more interested in how he felt, you know, what he remembered of that time, what the sensation was of being in those rooms, and trying to get him to open up. I mean, it struck me, having read his book before I did the film, that there was a very emotional story here that hadn't been told. There were lots of academic books about Shoah. There were lots of papers that had been written by universities. And so I felt in an... Yes, yeah, and his book is fantastic, and there are several other books on Shoah. But it really seemed to me that the emotional story here was missing. His emotional story, and how it affected him, you know, as a second-generation Holocaust story, and what he lives with. And although he says, you know, it took some months to recover, I got the sense that he still hasn't fully recovered from the experience of those years. You know, I mean. He's a deeply saddened individual. Yeah.
To follow up on that, you indicate in the film that he Lanzmann took more than 200 hours.
225 hours of footage.
225 hours. So even a 9.5-hour film leaves a great deal on the cutting room floor.
Well, in the years since Shoah's release, he's made 4 films from that outtake material. The most recent of which was the 2013 film, The Last of the Unjust. It was very good. So it has really become his life's work.
Hello.
Let's go to the next question. You have the microphone.
How did he respond? When he saw the documentary, how did he respond to the documentary?
Well, he was asked in the press this week, and he said he thought it was rather good. This is after the Oscar nomination. Before the Oscar nomination, he said, "I don't object to the film."
And the second part is, how does one have the opportunity to see the Shoah now, today?
There are a number of ways, and I get asked this all the time at screenings. And what I often tell people is, firstly, check your local library. Many libraries carry his film on DVD. If you want to own it, you can buy it from Amazon. The Criterion Collection did a wonderful restoration of it. It's about $100, $120 to buy on DVD. But if you just want to watch it, I usually tell people, check your local library first, yeah. And museums, of course.
Yes, your film is quite amazing, very fascinating, and I think you certainly accomplished showing us the emotional side of this man. He is incredibly interesting. I would like to see more. I would have liked it to be much longer. My question is, how do you know how this affected his personal life in terms of, did he ever marry? Was the baby that we saw, was that a child or a grandchild? I would be very interested to know that.
So he married 3 times. The child is his son, who I met. You know, I mean, the French are often quite private people, and I got the sense that he was quite a private person in some respects. Although he was happy to talk about his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, which of course is of huge historical interest in and of itself, I got the sense that it wouldn't have been too productive to talk about his marriages, his children. That he wouldn't have had much of an appetite to talk about that, and that it wouldn't ultimately have been as interesting as talking about his life's work. And in the sense of the film being longer, I got the feeling as I was making it that it would have been a very thin feature film. And that often people tell me, you know, I didn't want it to end. But I sometimes feel like that's quite a good thing, to leave the audience wanting a little bit more. I think that stretched over 90 minutes, it perhaps wouldn't have been as powerful.
We're going to go here and then over there. Go ahead, please.
Because Thomas had said in the beginning of the film that his film was sort of basically it's shown in every school. It's the film that shows us about the Holocaust. You spoke a little bit with him at the end of the film of his viewpoint, or I guess like his outlook on, I guess, the rest of his life and also looking forward. And I'm of the younger generation. You know, every year the Holocaust gets further and further away, which is sad. But did he have were there any conversations that existed outside of the film on whether his outlook on how he could keep the Shoah's, you know, memory alive? Yeah. Well,
you know, I can tell you, having just communicated, that apparently he's working on a new film now. You know, and he made The Last of the Unjust in 2013. He made the Karski Report in 2010. He made Sobibor, and he made A Visitor from the Living. So he continues to make films from this material, and not only that, but for a 90-year-old man, he stays remarkably active. He speaks at conferences. He travels the world. He goes to screenings of Shoah. So this really has become his life's work. It extended beyond the release. I will say I found him to be an interesting mixture of optimism and pessimism. He clearly is very pessimistic, but he also says, I'm full of life. I hate the idea of dying. So I found there to be an interesting contradiction there between these two outlooks. He's a remarkable and complicated person.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. The documentary is unbelievable. Where did you get all of the personal footage? Did he give that to you, or did he, of his personal life?
Yeah. So, Shoah is 10 hours long, 9.5, just over 9.5 hours long, and he filmed some 225 hours of material in the process of making it. Everything that wasn't used in the film, the other 215 hours, if you will, he is in the possession of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem. They jointly own it. So I worked with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to digitize a lot of that footage. For any of you here who haven't seen Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, there's actually very little material from that film in my film. It's almost entirely made out of previously unseen footage which we newly digitized, including that sequence with Schubert, which I was shocked to discover actually existed. The footage that he filmed in Tel Aviv at the seaside, just on the subject of that Schubert sequence, that was really one of the really shocking discoveries for me, because it showed just how prevalent anti-Semitism still was, even as late as 1979. What really struck me about that sequence of the film was that at its core, a Jewish filmmaker went to interview a Nazi, an SS officer. The Nazi, or the Nazi's family, attacked and severely beat up the Jewish filmmaker, and the authorities came along and pressed charges against the Jewish filmmaker. And this wasn't in 1950, this was in 1979. So, that to me was quite stunning, and that footage existed of that. I had read about this in his book, but I didn't know that footage existed. Similarly, I knew that if he was prepared to talk about his relationships with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, that there existed photographs of the three of them. But I didn't know until I began researching. I found this 1967 Canadian documentary that was just on de Beauvoir and Sartre. At a certain point in my research, I thought, well, it might be nice to have some video footage of de Beauvoir to show whilst they're talking. So I'm watching this film from the 1960s, and I hear this voice, and I'm thinking, that kind of sounds a bit like Claude Lanzmann. And then this guy comes on the screen with his matte black hair and his horn-rimmed glasses, and I'm thinking, that kind of looks a bit like Claude Lanzmann. And then I had this moment, which was, when I realized that it was a young Claude Lanzmann with Simone de Beauvoir smoking and flirting in Jean-Paul Sartre's apartment. So really, the making of the film was a series of wonderful discoveries in terms of the archival footage that existed. I think I got very lucky with that footage. But the majority of it, to answer your question in a long-winded, roundabout way, the majority of it came from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And they're also very happy with the film, just to go back to what you were saying. For them, it can be challenging to get younger audiences interested in the Holocaust, or to find a fresh way to talk about it. So for them, a film like this, which is a kind of a second-generation Holocaust story, it's very helpful for them to get people interested in the educational outreach efforts that they make.
Yes.
So the question was, were the Nazis that he interviewed ever brought to trial? And the answer is yes. In the case of Heinz Schubert, for example, he had gone on trial. He had been sentenced to death. His sentence had been commuted to 10 years. or it had been commuted and he ended up serving 10 years. So he had been in prison and then been released, you know. And that's something that to me was, you know, I mean, I'm not a Holocaust historian. My background is as a journalist in film, so I mean, I learned a lot in the process of doing this film, you know, studying at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, reading up about it. And I guess I just had this idea in my mind that all of the Nazis that were convicted went to jail forever, and of course that wasn't the case. Some of them got 10 years in prison, 5 years in prison, and then were released and carried on with their lives. So I think the majority of the former SS officers that Lanzmann interviewed had been in jail and had served short sentences and been released.
I'd like to thank you very much for a very beautiful film. I'm back here in the last row.
Hello.
And I'd like to have your comment regarding before the film, as we were sitting here. I don't know if the slides that were coming up on the screen were yours or the museum's, but they were very, very moving about survivors and how optimistic and hopeful and loving they were considering what went on. And I sort of feel more, Claude said he's not optimistic, and maybe after working 12 years on the theme, it perhaps depressed him. How about you? And how do you explain how people who suffered like that could be so kind and loving?
I mean, that's a challenging question. It kind of runs the whole gamut of human emotion there. There's the whole human spectrum, you know. There are, you know, I saw a film, it was released, I think in 2013, maybe some of you saw it, called The Lady in Number 6, about Alice Hertz Sommer. She was 110 years old, she played piano every day. It won an Academy Award, yes. But I mean, I was struck by her positivity, you know, and her optimism, and the smile that she greeted every day with. And yet, in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, you see he interviews a survivor, and the survivor says to him, I forget the name of the survivor, you'll have I have to apologize, but I remember the quote. He said, "If you could lick my heart, it would poison you." And it's one of the most striking lines in the film. So, I mean, I think it's way above my pay grade to assess how people responded to the events of those years who were there, you know. I mean, I have nothing but, I mean, look, I have nothing but admiration for people who can turn the other cheek and be positive, and I have nothing but understanding for people who can't.
The slides, I'm happy to tell you, are pictures of the Holocaust survivors who volunteer here at the Museum of Tolerance. Many of them share their stories every day with the hundreds and thousands of visitors to the museum, always with a message of humanity and positivity, and they are truly a source of inspiration to everyone who hears them and meets them, and many of them are here tonight, so we're always proud to show them.
I have a question here. Go ahead. At the back.
Hello.
Hi. You mentioned that the movie was supposed to take 2 years to make and ended up making 12. Who financially sponsored the period of film? I mean, 12 years is a long time to sponsor somebody. How did he financially?
Well, so yes, the question about how he financially supported himself. First off, he had a grant from the Israeli government to make the film. You know, I will say that it was kind of an ongoing process of burning his bridges. He kind of got some financing, and then got some financing somewhere else, and then got some financing somewhere else, and his backers kind of despaired. It's one of the reasons he felt so so depressed when he nearly drowned, you know, and he says, you know, as he says in my film, I had to lie to everybody. He felt very bad about that because the people who he was not fulfilling his obligations to, in terms of at least a financial sense, were people who were friends of his, people who trusted in him. And after the Israeli government was no longer able to support the film, the French government came and stepped in. Mitterrand financed him so that he could continue, and then I think he got some more Israeli support as he went along, and he got donations from people, you know, $5 here, $10 here. He was financially very poor when the film was finished, you know. I think I remember reading an interview where he just said he just hoped that he wouldn't live in crippling poverty for the rest of his life after making it. But in his mind, you know, there was only one way to make the film. He knew that he couldn't just phone it in and make this 2-hour-long film. He had this idea of the size and scope that it had to be this mammoth, behemoth work. So,
please go ahead.
Okay, so this film does paint kind of a morbid picture of the man, of Claude Lanzmann, right? And kind of going back to what the person before the last said about the Holocaust survivors being inspirational, do you think that like the attention, because this film has gotten a considerable amount of attention in comparison sort of to the Shoah, right, which is not very well known, do you feel that people seeing this and then seeing the Shoah after is going to affect their perception of the film?
yeah, absolutely. I think it will accept the perception. I mean, I don't think I've been to a screening yet where someone hasn't said to me, how can I see his film, you know? And that's exactly the reaction I would hope for, you know? That people who have seen it feel it sheds some light. You know, I tried to make it an accessible film that you wouldn't necessarily need to have seen his film to see it. That's one of the reasons why at the beginning of my film there's this little section where you have experts, academics, other filmmakers contextualizing what Shoah is. If you haven't seen it, you know, it's this masterpiece about the Holocaust, and the guy who made it is difficult, you know.
No, I guess I mean, but what I mean is that for those people who haven't seen it and saw this first, right, do you feel that that his morbidity is going to affect their understanding of the film when they see it after? Like it would have a darker meaning in the end versus maybe they would get inspiration from it, or...
Well, yeah, I hope so. I mean, I hope it leads them to watch his film. I think that they'll see it slightly differently than if they hadn't, because they'll have an understanding of everything that went into the making of it, you know. Just for example, if you watch Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, you might see the scene in the barbershop and think, you know, that's a very powerful scene. But then when you learn that he spent years tracking this man down, traveling around New York with nothing but an old address, knocking on doors, going into barbershops in a pre-internet age, pre-cell phone age, with just a name on a piece of paper, talking to people, trying to track this man down, you know. Shows you the lengths that he went to.
For the last question tonight, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a beautiful film. I was struck how he loved and respected his father, and mentioned that the father saved him and his brothers. Did he say how his father saved them?
Well, I know the answer. I mean, in terms of his years in the resistance, pretty much everything that he had to say is in the film. You know, and that was another example of trying to get a sense of how much he was comfortable to talk about. But his father, who was also in the resistance, and they didn't know, by the way, Claude didn't know that his father, Armand, was in the resistance, and Armand didn't know that Claude was in the resistance. But they changed their surname. The family changed its surname during the war, and were kind of hidden in plain sight by the town that they were living in. So quite remarkably, you know, everybody in the town just said that they weren't Jewish, and he, as he writes in his memoir, everybody at his school knew that he was Jewish. His teachers knew that he was Jewish, but they, you know, in that respect, we're very fortunate. And as he writes about, he has this guilt that he thinks about in his mind how he would have behaved if he'd been captured. Would he have given up the names of other resistance fighters? He knows that everybody breaks under torture eventually, and he you know, that affects him very profoundly. You know, he's written about that. So, I mean, I thought it was really important to mention in the film, you know, that the Holocaust isn't an abstract concept to him. He was a Jew living in France. You know, he was at risk.
I'm going to take your good advice and conclude the evening, leaving us wanting more. We look forward to seeing you on the red carpet and wish you luck.
Thank you all again for coming.
And I most especially want to thank you for providing another portal through which to encourage the present and future generations to explore new knowledge and understanding of the Shoah. It is through these new vehicles and different perspectives and interesting ways of approaching the topic that we will be able to sustain the memory and the education about a seminal event in our history. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Hey, Rabbi Lies.